Well, I was assuming that they were so related that one was part of the other, or that. Well, I know that I'm thinking that her primary care doc needs to grow pounds and get you.
Hello. Hello.
It'd be nice to fix something.
I figured when you didn't answer, it was some kind of an accidental call. I'm thinking, why is he calling me from somewhere in the building?
He missed you.
You want to see how you're doing, right?
Yep. Figured he couldn't get away from something. I don't know. Almost time to start. Okay. We're going to be covering Genesis 32 to 36. Rich, you did do the 27 to 31 last week?
I only got to about, I didn't get to 30.
Okay. Well, I'm only covering kind of in detail a little portion of tonight's anyway. So we're going to kind of talk in general terms about Jacob after he comes back tonight from from his wife and his family, returning from Laban after he leaves him. But before we get started, let's just have a word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this evening that we can consider your word, to meditate upon the things that you have saved for us to learn from and understand, that we might see the examples of those who have gone before, learn from their mistakes as well as their faith, that we might learn to grow in you and become stronger in our faith, and that our faith might lead us to better exemplify your Son in our life in every way. We hope, Father, that you will grant us wisdom to understand the things that are important from your word, that we might grow by them. And we hope that you will be with us, and that we can apply this wisdom in a way that edifies one another and allows us to better help our neighbors and our friends and our acquaintances throughout the world. And we thank you for this time, and we thank you for the healing that you've done for many in our group. And we pray that you will continue to watch over us and provide for us, and continue to help us be strong and courageous throughout our life. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, so, last week, Rich was kind of going over, the sections here in end of chapter, or in the 20s, later 20s of Genesis, just about how Jacob, how he prospered when he left and he went, to Abraham's, or his cousins and things, and met, ultimately married Leah and Rachel, and then how he prospered. One of the things that we ought to, as we read through Genesis, we always ought to remember is we need to remember that this is being written down by Moses hundreds of years after these things have taken place to a people who are coming into the land that God promised to Abraham, promised to Isaac, promised to Jacob, And he even uses names of cities and things that were not the names at the time it happened. He's using the names the Israelites will know them by, because hundreds of years later they've been renamed. Okay? Edom, which he refers to, it wasn't Edom before Esau established his home there. And yet he refers to it as Edom when Esau moves there. Well, it wasn't Edom when Esau moved there. But he calls it that because the Israelites, that's how they know it, right? It would be like us, somebody writing today, somebody naming a city hundreds of years ago, and they would write a story and use the name that was used, 400 years ago. Well, we wouldn't know it. But if you use the name that we know it by, then we can explain how it got the name. Okay, and so much of what's happening throughout, especially from chapter 12 on with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph would become really the primary focus from 12 through the end of the book of Genesis, that he's giving Israelites a certain important facts about their history that matter relative to the promise God gave to Abraham and why they are being brought into this land by God at this time. So they're being given kind of the highlights of that. They're not being given all the history. It's not trying to give them an entire history of what has happened in all these hundreds of years. It's simply trying to help them understand how, their forefathers got this promise, got this blessing, why they are being given this land, okay, and who all the people are, who are the Edomites, who are the Moabites, who are the Ammonites. These are all relatives of theirs, okay? These are all people that they probably know to some degree, but they don't necessarily know. I mean, how many of you necessarily know every kind of connection to all of your cousins? Unless somebody kind of goes through a lineage with you and shows you, then you might not, you go to maybe a family reunion or something and they are like, oh, a cousin is like, well, who are you related to and how are we related? And I don't know how we're connected. And then you kind of go through who their parents were and who the, sisters or siblings were that you're connected to. And the bigger the family is, the more that's a really crazy heritage. And they have very large families, right? A lot of kids in these families. And so there's a lot of just understanding the basics of where all these people essentially come from. And here's the other thing to think about. When we think about the law of Moses essentially says that the firstborn son is going to get a double portion, right? Why does the firstborn son get a double portion?
He also gets to take care of his mother, doesn't he?
Okay. So the firstborn son is the one who is going to get the double portion. And part of that will be actually where their family parents live. Okay, what the parents have. Because you're going to take care of your mom, you're also going to take care of your dad. If he lives long enough and is unable to kind of keep working, in at some point. Just much like kings, Solomon became king before David was completely gone. Kings often transfer before a king would actually pass away. They might transfer it when somebody was just too ill to really serve anymore. Now, in that situation, what would happen? Did when a king, like when Solomon took over for David, did Solomon all of a sudden become more powerful than David? Now that he's the king, is he more powerful than David? No, because it never worked that way. He could now have all the co-regency powers, but he could never become more powerful. He could never have authority over his father. And the same is essentially true even in the firstborn son taking over the father's household And even if he had to take care of his father and take care of his mother, and he maybe even take care of other, sisters or whatever, he really didn't end up ruling over his father. If his father said something, it would still go. That would still kind of be what he had to do. But all of those rules are none of them apply to the patriarchs under the promise of God after Abraham. Not a single one of them is the firstborn son of their father. Did you know that? Isaac's not the firstborn son, is he? But he's the son of promise. Ishmael's not a son of, even though he's the firstborn son, he's not the son of promise. They're like, nope, that's not the one. So Isaac has, now with this one we typically know, right? Jacob and Esau. So you have two twins, like, well, they're twins, what does it matter? No, it mattered. Which one came out first was firstborn, period. It didn't matter if it was a minute, it didn't matter if it was 10 minutes. It didn't matter if he's got his hand on his leg, like Jacob did to Esau. Esau's the firstborn son. There were no co-twins as firstborns. They never come out, at least I've never heard of it. They don't ever come out at the same time. Twins, I haven't seen it done with puppies either. And so, we understand with Jacob, and a little bit of, some of the things I think Rich probably covered last week, kind of how Jacob ended up taking over some of Esau's rights, blessings. Now, why would you say Jacob got those things? He got the promises and not Esau. How would you sum it up? Most of us know the stories pretty well, right?
There was some definitive conniving on his part.
Mm-hmm. And his mom's.
And his mother helped too.
She probably directed most of it.
Yeah, right. But I mean, it was, they were.
And he probably doesn't do any of it if his mother hadn't actually
Right.
advised him all the way through it.
They both together flipped the script.
Yeah, that's what happened though. My answer is why.
Because Esau sold his birthright.
Esau sold his birthright, that's true, but but that's not really why yet.
Because God
God's
wanted him to.
Because
Yeah.
God wanted him to.
Right.
All right?
God wanted it to be Isaac. That's
God
all.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay. Now, do we know God wanted it to be him before that? Is there anything that tells us it had to be Jacob? Now, God told him, Ishmael, that's not the one. That's not the son of promise. We know that from the beginning. I don't know. Do we know that about Esau and Jacob? I can't think of it, but it certainly works out that way.
But he could have, it is kind of a strange story because there's deception,
Mhm.
which, you think that shouldn't be that way.
Kind of
but he
fits
sold
fits
his
really well with
birthright,
his
like I
grandfather,
said.
though.
He sold it, so he gave up that right.
Mhm.
He despised it, counted it as not important at all.
Now we're getting to the why. That's kind of what I wanted to get at. You're now hitting it, because now we're getting why. Before we were talking about the what
Mm.
happened. I'm not as interested in what as why. Yeah.
I was gonna say that there was a promise.
Was there a promise about it?
The Lord did tell,
The younger would
yes.
rule over the older?
2 nations are your rule, 2 peoples.
Okay.
And then you shall be divided, one shall
Yep.
be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger.
Okay.
So,
Good. And this is, I think, one of those things where we look at and we see God's foresight. Is God saying, listen, I just want the younger. I prefer the younger. Is he doing that because he's like, he's capricious about his choices? Because I think the why, and Dondi really began to hit on it, and I think the why Jacob would be, in spite of the deception he and his mother do, I think there's something about Jacob that fits what God is looking for more than Esau. So you mentioned already, Esau despised his birthright. And what does that mean? He despised his birthright. Did he look at it and go, I hate that?
No, he's disregarded it, he considered it not special or important.
Yeah, he sold it for
Meal.
not a,
Not a good meal.
yeah. He didn't, it's like he didn't even, it's like, hey, you have to make all my meals for a year. Like a single meal. How much he valued it, he just didn't have much of it. It wasn't very valuable to him. And that's what it means for that he despised it. Jacob, on the other hand, he lied and cheated and deceived because he considered it valuable, didn't he? And that's the attitude that we see in Jacob that we don't see in Esau. You can say something else?
Well, I think about this story as being related to like Sarah trying to help, you know, by giving her maid to Abraham, you know, trying to help God fulfill his promise. If
Right.
they had done nothing, it would have worked out the way God wanted it to work out, don't you think? I mean, that's what I keep thinking. They helped God somehow,
Yeah.
and he let them in that case. He let them,
Yeah. I always think of it as God just uses what people do
right.
to accomplish what he wants. He can accomplish what he wants regardless of what people do. Like he tells us way ahead of time that Jesus is going to be a curse and be hung upon a tree, which the law says is a curse. Foretelling this particular method of killing people. Is God then going, this is a good way to execute people? Did God say that's a good way to execute people, the cross? No, in fact, he forbid that in the law. But he knew what people would be doing, and he foretold it. And he used it. And so God uses, I think, knowing what people do. Because also, he's choosing amongst people, isn't he? It's like, well, why didn't he choose somebody better? Well, okay, who's better that wouldn't have sin? Nobody. He already chose the best that he probably had in Noah, in Abraham, in Isaac and Jacob, and these are the best. He chose the ones he desired. But you see in Jacob not only how much he values the birthright, but then the blessing, how important it was for him. Now his mother is probably, you have Esau, so you have Isaac and Rebekah, and they appear to have favorites amongst these twins. And she's like, this really needs to go to Jacob. He's by far the better son here. But Isaac, he likes his rough and tumble, hunter, son. But I think you almost can see that Rebekah probably had a better sense of which of those two has a more righteous mind and heart. It's certainly not Esau. As you see it play out, Esau is not. I mean, his wives that he chooses are all terrible choices, but he does it regardless, doesn't listen to his father. Jacob listens to his father, even in terms of getting married. Now, him ultimately having the two wives and then, multiple, probably concubines, which, remember, a concubine is a wife. What's the difference between a concubine and a wife? They're all wives. What the difference is?
Sometimes kids don't inherit.
Yes, the concubine children don't have inheritance rights. It's the only real difference between that. And so, but anyway, so he gets all these wives, not really even by his own desire. I mean, he really only desires one woman, right? In the whole thing, we don't see Jacob ever desiring any other women than the one wife he wanted, and then got tricked into others, and then got kind of talked into more. So you see in Jacob not a perfect person, but a person whose the promise of God The blessings of God mattered. Right? Because we could say the same thing with David. David's no perfect person, is he? Not even by a, I mean, as a youth, he looks really good. But man, as an old man, this guy's got a lot on his plate. Nobody should want to emulate David in their life. Now, you want to emulate the heart of David, the desire to do God's will part of David. But you don't want to copy what David practiced in life much of the time. And so, it's about that desire to know God and to receive God's blessings that are really central and what's important. And you do see, and it isn't just here, you do see the mother of these sons that desire this matter. Even when it comes to who becomes king after David. You see that, Solomon's mother, the mother has a tremendous amount of influence on their sons. It isn't just their father. Especially when you have a father as king. Who do you think is probably primarily raising that boy until he's, close to a man? Yeah, mom's probably going to have a great deal more influence on him than you've got a father who's a king. How much time is he going to have? Especially when he's got a whole bunch of children. And so you do see the mother, I think, if you look through and you kind of see all through the heritage in the Old Testament, you find how important the mothers are to the people who desire God.
I was going to say, as you go through the Kings in 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, it always mentions the mother's name.
Mm-hmm.
So that
Yeah.
mother was very important.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so, and then, so we look through here, all of these children of promise. These are the ones who desire God's blessings. Jacob eventually leaves. Laban gets away. And even though Laban is trying to prevent that. In 31, we have him fleeing. And in this, there's a little story, a backstory, because we do read about these aren't all wonderful people, even though Rachel appears to be a very godly person. When she leaves, she takes what? All of these idols. So you have a concept. This goes even into Joshua when at the end of Joshua, when Joshua is going to basically tell the nation of Israel, you need to put away the gods of our fathers from the other side of the river. When he's talking about the other side of the river, he's talking about where Abraham came from. Right? And Abraham and his family, they all had the idols up there. Abraham seems to have put them away. A lot of his sons seem to have not done that, but their families are often involved, and so it's been around, and they don't cease to. When they go down, they come up out of Egypt with a lot more idols again. They bring them all into Canaan. So, okay, so then we have, as we get into chapter 32. Jacob is afraid of Esau, right? Remember, this is one of the reasons that he left. He's like, Esau's going to kill me. Because that's what Esau said. He's like, well, I'm going to wait till my dad's dead, but I'm going to kill him. For taking my birthright and taking my... And probably more than the birthright even was the blessing. Because the blessing that he got from his father was like, oh, you're going to end up kind of serving your brother. Like, oh, great. I'm going to kill him. That's Esau. And so he flees. His mother tells him, you really should get out of here. His dad says, listen, I want you to go take a wife from, my family. and don't take a wife from any of these tribes around here. And so he does that. Eventually comes back, and he comes back wealthy. He's got a great deal of wealth, big household. But his household is not as big as Esau's at this point. And so Esau appears. As Jacob is coming down, Esau comes with 400 men. That seems like an army. That seems like a lot more people than you would just normally travel with. So he's thinking, so kind of, do you remember what essentially he did when he realized that Esau's coming with this massive number of people?
This is his favorites first.
He did. He separated into two camps. He does seem to be the less favored in front.
Just to bribe them.
Yep.
Here's some gifts.
Couple of different camps so that if they get attacked, one camp can flee, because he doesn't feel like we can fight him. So listen, if they attack one camp or the other, then the other just take off. We'll get out of here. But yeah, he by the way, it says in this place, in verse chapter 32, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." So he called the name of that place Mahanaim, okay, which essentially means two camps. Which you go, well, how does that fit with angels? But then you got to keep reading, because this name doesn't just refer to seeing a couple of angels. It says, "And Jacob sent angels before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing him, 'Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, female servants. I have sent to tell my lord in order that I may find favor in your sight.' And the angels returned to Jacob, saying, 'We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him.' Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, divided the people who were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two camps, thinking, if Esau comes to one camp and attacks it, then the other camp is left will escape." It actually seems like the name two camps refers to the whole event, right? Not saying a couple of angels. Now, anybody interested in why I read it the way I did? These words messengers are the exact same word as the word angel in the beginning. Okay? This is the challenge of us reading translated into English, because the translators are telling us, okay, we don't want to use the word angel because that might be some spirit being that's, maybe looks like a person, but it's not really a person. And then, well, this is probably an angel who really is a person. And the only reason, and most of the time as I read through Scripture, I think the translators are right, but we don't see it. And so what it helps us, what it does to us is when we see the term angel, we automatically think it must be some kind of spiritual being, when the readers of these in the original languages would not have had that sense. Right? If you had all of these same term messengers through here, you'd go, oh, okay. Or are these messengers up here spirit beings from God, or are these human beings sent from somebody? So anyway, so he fears him, and they kind of he's offering him. He probably wouldn't term it a bribe, but a tribute. I'm going to pay a nice tax to you here who live here. And it's the same kind of thing they would do, Abraham would have done, all of these. When they traveled into an area, especially you're coming with this fairly large contingent of people. I mean, Esau's not the only person who's going to be like, why are all these hundreds of people traveling across here? Any one of the kings in any one of these little cities would have had the same kind of fear. All right. And so, anyway, they essentially make a little bit of peace, but then, that night, he rises up, takes his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. Jacob was left alone. A man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Now, this is that story. Now, notice, he started to leave at night. And it happens at the break of day. We often picture, I don't know, do most of you picture him wrestling with some guy all night long? Now, I think the better term for wrestling, because when I think of see wrestling, I either think WWE type wrestling, or I think, I don't know, just kind of, I think like high school wrestling team, or that kind of wrestling. This appears more like a fight. I think we would just because a lot of fights end up kind of wrestling around. But it could be that it's happened sometime in the middle of the night, closer to daybreak. And it kind of ends at daybreak, but he's already nighttime when he's like getting out of there, right? He's giving him some space and giving his wives and his children some space from what might be trouble, right? But this is one of those stories that he's wrestling with this man, and then later on he says, I saw God face to face. And so he wrestles with God, which is what the name Israel means. Why is Jacob renamed Israel? Because of this story. This story is given to us to help us understand why his name has changed. But it's a strange story, because why else is it given to us? It helps us explain also why Israelites in Moses' time, they were not eating a certain piece of meat from the animals. Well, because God struck Jacob in his hip and he's limping around, got a bad hip now. I don't know if it healed. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it permanently damaged. I don't know. But he's limping initially after this. But to me, this is a strange story. If this person, this man that appears to him and wrestling with him, and he basically is fighting him, he's like, you've got to give me a blessing. Now, we might think, okay, obviously knows it's God at that point. I'm not sure that's what that means, because we think blessing, we think from God. But this simply means you've got to give me a good word. And what that might mean, he's thinking this, he's kind of traveling through some guy's territory. He wants that person to give him, say, a good word. You're not going to attack me. You're not coming after me. You got to give me some word of peace or something, some kind of blessing here. That's what he's wanting from this man. And then he kind of realizes, wow, this seems like a different person than just some guy. But it seems like they fight to a stalemate. Why would God fight somebody to a stalemate? God, who can do anything and has all power, appear to him in some man and fight him to a stalemate. Is that weird, or is that just me?
That's weird.
This is one of the few stories in all of, only just a handful of stories in Scripture that I just look at and I go, I don't know that I fully get this story. I just don't fully get this story. I don't know what this is all about. I know the few things it mentions, but it's like, why is this even happening? I don't know. That's my answer for you. But it's one of those interesting things, and it's why they didn't eat a certain piece of meat. Okay. So you come then into chapter 33, and Jacob finally does meet Esau. They come together. He divided his children, when they meet and everything. And Esau runs up and embraces him, falls on his neck, kisses him, and weeps. And Esau lifted up his eyes, saw the women and children, and who are these with you? And he talks about his children, all that he had. And so you see this little bit of a peace. But you still have this sense that it's a peace, and they're kind of happy to see each other, but there's still some contention there, isn't there? There's still some, I don't really want to travel with you. I'll kind of hang back. Well, you got to go ahead. I'll just stay with them. And anybody have siblings where you kind of understand this, you make peace, but you still, there's always some kind of underlying tension because of stuff that's happened? Yeah, I think that's probably real. Did you say something?
Well, wouldn't it have also been at this point they couldn't have
Yeah, they
getting together just because their
right.
livestock and their resources would have been too much for the land.
Yeah, and that comes out a little bit later when Esau will split. In chapter 36, he will leave. Much like Abram and Lot had to do. They will be kind of in the same area. They're going to be close, and they will ultimately have to go. They'll have to kind of, okay. And this is how Esau's family ends up in the mountains of Edom. Is because he decides to go down south there. Because there's too many of them for that area. But they do dwell closely together, but just, a little bit enough that there's just a hair of fear there still. Especially I think from Jacob's side. He's not sure about his brother quite yet. And then we have the story of Dinah, which I call in 34 I have a worksheet. You guys don't have the worksheet, but the Dinah incident. Anybody know the story of Dinah? Daughter of Leah. So we've got this Hivite, this prince essentially of a tribe of Hivites, rapes her, but loves her and wants to marry her. And so, they basically try to he's like, Dad, you gotta make her my wife. And so they work out, kind of an agreement with a couple of sons of Jacob. And they, well, if all the males are circumcised, then we'll go ahead and let her marry, your son Shechem. And basically two of the, let me remember which two again here. Two of the, I think it's Simeon and Levi, they're going to take advantage of their circumcising all the males and go and kill them all. And it's like, oh, wow, vengeance. This is, I think, an important story, not from like, well, look how bad people are. But this helps us understand, this is a time and place where, why do women have to be in their father's household or their husband's household? And we kind of look at that and go, well, it's just so unfair. I think just from a practical standpoint, women couldn't be out on their own. There's no police force. There's nobody to protect you except your family, your tribe, your city or whatever. Whatever your group is, that's your only protection, whether that's a male or a female. But everybody needs a tribe. We kind of have now societies that, well, not all societies in the world are like ours, where we have, kind of like individual people can kind of live peacefully, someplace. But this is just not that kind of hierarchy structure, especially, in a nation building kind of way. This really hasn't happened yet. At least not in most of the world, and so there needs to be protection. And the only people that take vengeance, the only people that bring justice to somebody who murders or kills, it's much like in the whole law. Why is there that person who is the avenger of blood? It doesn't seem like we would have an avenger of blood in a civilized country. And God, by the way, takes the avenger of blood, which is something that was already happening within their cultures, and he kind of allows it to keep happening, but he also says, okay, you have to listen to the court system. You don't just go get to kill them. If they flee to a city of refuge, you can't kill them. And so and then the courts and the judge will ultimately decide whether that person is actually guilty and needs to be put to death or not. But who the Avenger of Blood was? Avenger of Blood was simply a close family member whose job was to go execute vengeance. justice for whatever evil had been done to their family member, especially for murder, but they would go kill the person. Right? And, you know, so God kind of regulates it a bit, so you know, this is just a time frame, and also I think it's a story that helps us understand why it was so important and why they would have wanted to have large households. You didn't just want a few people, you didn't want to, you know, 2 parents and 2 kids, you know, a nice white picket fence. You'd have been nice pickings for all the other people, right? You needed large, multi-generation lots of people to really protect yourself. You know, most of these places, and this doesn't go away soon, right? I mean, we still see this same kind of awful behavior happening even in Israel, you know, hundreds of years later. Okay. Ultimately, though, it ends with Jacob going, "What have you done?" Because these Hivites took vengeance on him. What do you think the other Hivites are going to think? It's not the only family of Hivites around here. These other Canaanites are going to be coming after us too. So what have you done to us? And they're kind of like, well, you're not going to let him treat her like a prostitute, are you? You know, that end of chapter 34. And so, but God then will tell Jacob, you need to arise and go to Bethel and dwell there. And you're going to make an altar there, you know, for when God appeared to him when he was first fleeing from Esau. So, I only have 5 minutes left. So I can read all of it here, but we have in this story, though, again, the renaming of Jacob to Israel. And so he called his name Israel in verse 10. God said to him, I am God Almighty, which is El Shaddai, okay? Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. Interesting statement, because when we think about kings in Israel, don't we see all through the beginning that they shouldn't have kings? And doesn't Samuel go, why are you wanting a king? And yet we see from the very beginning, going all the way back here, that God had already promised kings coming from them. And we see actually even a little bit further on, I believe it's in chapter 36, when it accounts for the family, it gives us the genealogy of Esau, that tells us the kings of Esau in Edom before Israel had any kings. And you go, well, wait a second, why is Moses writing about kings when they're not supposed to have a king? So it's this weird little, and yet they're not supposed to have a king, and yet in the law of Moses, it accounts for a king, doesn't it? You remember one law specifically given to kings in Israel that the law stated? Are you right?
Was he keeping a copy of the law?
Yeah, not only keeping a copy, they had to write their own copy of the law. Now, I don't know if a single king in Israel ever did that. Maybe David, you know, maybe Josiah. I can't hardly picture another one doing that. I could picture Solomon having one that he assigned somebody to write for him. I don't know if that's accurate, but I can picture that. You can picture Solomon doing that. But, so, it's an interesting, it's an interesting kind of push and pull, I think, throughout the early scriptures of the Old Testament before they ultimately have a king. Because why Samuel's like, why are you wanting a king? God is your king. And then they're rejecting God, and you know, and yet we see these foretelling of kings long before they even have one. I mean, long before they even have any. So we see these promises there. Finally, we see the death of Rachel and Isaac. Isaac lives to be 180 years old. And he lives in the city of Hebron. That becomes a really important city, doesn't it? Wow. what is the importance of Hebron? The fact that not only, and by the way, it's not just where Isaac dwelt. It's also where Abraham did. Okay? It says Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. So Moses is helping them understand even the names of these cities, and they're kind of, and because in their time it's called Hebron. So you have not only it is kind of this ancient city of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but then it becomes, what else? And what is its kind of distinguished? We always think of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem wasn't really a Hebrew city, of Abraham and his before, later on. But Hebron, whose city was it when they all come in? Well, okay, let me rephrase the question. It is Canaanites, but which Israelite gets the city of Hebron when Israel destroys the Canaanites or defeats the Canaanites? Huh? It's one of the two spies who's still old enough. Huh? Yeah, it's Caleb. Caleb, he's like, and what's interesting is when they get in Joshua, it tells us that Caleb goes and takes it. They get in, Caleb's like, hey, we're done defeating the armies, and he goes down and takes the city. He's like, hey, this one was promised to me. Caleb wanted the city of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, right? And after that, it becomes, when is the next kind of significance of the city of Hebron? It is the capital for 7 years of David's kingdom before he ultimately moves to Jerusalem. Okay, so Hebron is a really central key figure. Okay, and then we're not going to go through Esau's descendants even next week. I mean, all of chapter 36 is basically the generations of Esau. That is Edom. And, so we're not going to kind of even look at that at all next week. We're going to come right down into, because we move from Jacob to Joseph. And we're going to, I did want to point one little verse out, though. In verse 22 of chapter 35, while Israel lived in that land, now, we're not talking about the nation, are we? We're talking about the person Jacob. While Israel lived in that land, talking about Mamre, which is Hebron, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, which is one of the wives he had from Leah, I'm pretty sure it was Leah. And his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. And then basically it ignores it. But do you know the significance of why that's recorded for us?
Good evening. There we go. Tonight, let's turn to number 38 in the hymnal. Number 38, Awesome God. We will sing this faster on each verse. And when we sing the very last line, watch me for the beats. I'm going to be creative. Naughty law. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God Please mark your songbooks at number 945. We will sing song 945 after the invitation. Kneel at the cross.
Well, a few announcements to just kind of make to everybody. Rich and I got a fairly long text from Dave just an hour or so ago. This is the most he's texted since in the last few weeks. So it's good to see that he's able to do that. Says he's still talking a little funny. He's going to have some therapy for a while, but he is in a rehab facility. Which facility? Do you know? Huh? St. Al's Rehab. Is that in Boise?
Yeah.
Okay. So Debbie is there with him also all the time, helping him kind of get through that rehab. It will be some time. They do think he has been doing well in these early days, regaining strength, his lungs, and so but it will take some time. And he did say they see the cause for the stroke that he had, We're all glad for that, his recovery, and for our personal sake, for his family, and for those of us who know him and love him. We're glad that he's got some more time here. I'm not sure he's always going to be glad for that. Going on to meet God would, as Paul wrote, that's a greater gain. But for our sake, we'll have him a while longer, and so it's going to take a little while though to kind of regain his strength. It will take a bit. He keeps saying how much he sounds funny, so I don't know what that sounds like, but we'll be ready to make fun of him when we hear it. Hopefully he's listening right now, because that would be a very Crutchfield thing to do. There are a number of other people, though, who are needing prayers and things. One of the things that learned today is that the Dellingers will be moving back to Washington, and actually just the first week in November. So they're already pretty much packed and ready to go. They kind of held off telling everybody just because of all the circumstances, everybody praying for Dave and things. But they don't need any help in that. Everything kind of moved more quickly once they decided they wanted to move back home, be closer to family. Things moved fairly quickly as far as, I guess, getting their place sold and getting some place to move into. So they're only here for a couple more weeks. They do hope that they will be here this Sunday. They've been in Washington for the last couple of weeks. But so we'll miss them, and hopefully wish them Godspeed. Katie's still recovering pretty well. And I think most of our people who have been sick have generally been recovering well. I don't know of a lot. Hunter had to go to the emergency room. Is he doing okay, though? Yeah, okay. It's just been a lot of stuff happening. Steve and Yolanda still traveling, and they had a lot happening with her, breaking ribs, and had a number of falls before they kind of had traveled for a while. But anyway, and Ryan and Abigail deploying either this month or next, probably, to the Afghanistan area. We do have a fall cleanup day on the 6th of November, starting at 9 here. And not sure, hopefully Dave will be all recovered by then, so he can be here with his chainsaw and stuff to help us clean up. But I had to take. Dave can take it off this year. Okay, I think those are the only things. Unless there is something else really important, those are the kind of the important ones I could, as I look through all the list. I did want to talk just a little bit about the story of Jacob wrestling with God, and we were talking a little bit about it in our Genesis class tonight. To me, it's a very strange story. How he's just comes across some guy in some place, and they're fighting, and then, he touches his hip. I don't know if you ever picture, it's like, oh, it's just, God just taking a finger and touching his hip, and then it's out of joint and he can't use it. That, in real life, that's probably more of some kind of actual blow to that hip that damaged it so he couldn't walk properly. But it's a strange story about this idea of Jacob wrestling with God, wanting a blessing from this person. Doesn't appear for him to understand that he's wrestling with God in some way. But I think about it from the standpoint, why would God rename him and then all of the nation with a name that means wrestling with God or fighting with God? And I think most of us, and probably if we're really honest with ourselves, we found ourselves struggling, and you could also use the word wrestling here or fighting to be the struggle, that we all at one time or another will have struggles with God. And the struggle might be, how do I do what God told me to do? And it just seems too hard. It doesn't seem like I can do that. But we all might be just struggling to understand. It might be struggling to, feel like, Moses, and when God told him to do something, he's like, I don't have the ability to do that. I'm not the right person. You should choose somebody else. No, that's not me. I think all of us, one time or another, when we look at the things God has asked of us or calls on us to do, or regardless of the circumstances, feels like I can't do that. And that sometimes when that happens, people walk away from God. And we see Israel, many of the people of Israel walked away from God, and they went and followed after other idols, which often told them things that they enjoyed, and they could do stuff that they derived pleasure from, and that caused them to do all kinds of ungodly things in the name of some false god. And we can easily, in the struggle of trying to be godly in this world, we can sometimes feel like just I can't do it and giving up. And yet, Jacob never gives up, even with his hip, whatever happens to his hip and his inability to walk right, he doesn't give up. He won't give up. And we need to have that same kind of attribute, that same kind of character, because life is never going to go exactly the way we want it to go. And you can't wait to be faithful to God until you get all your ducks in a row. I don't know if you've ever been that person or heard of that person where you're just like, well, once I get all my ducks in a row, then I can kind of, once you get them all in a row, somebody's probably going to take a shotgun out and shoot some of them. So, you really ought to not worry about getting everything in a row and just figure out, how to live faithfully, and godly in whatever circumstances you find yourself in, right here and right now. And if it's a struggle, you're not the only one. Your struggle might be somewhat unique. One of the things that I've really been noticing a lot lately, in whether it's been suffering or grief, things that I study, things that I experience, that there's a lot of commonality, but there's also a lot of uniqueness. And they talk about people who grieve, that it's always unique. Yeah, it's somewhat true, but there's also a lot of commonalities to it too. I actually draw a lot of strength to that. There's a lot of commonalities, that none of us face difficulties, or none of us face temptations that other people don't face. That we only face temptations that are common to human beings. But our circumstances might be a little different than other people's circumstances. There are some unique set of facts around some of the suffering we endure. But others have done it too. And, I think one of the things about the book of Hebrews in chapter 11 is, you look at all those people who remained faithful in the midst of trouble, is that they all went through difficult times. They weren't all the same difficulties, but a lot of different difficulties. But they went through them. They remained steadfast. They kept going. And even through the struggle, even when it was hard, even when they didn't fully understand, even when they didn't fully get it, they just kept going and didn't give up. And that's really the character we see in Jacob, the characteristic that all of us need to grow. That's really what the Bible talks about, especially in the New Testament, the idea of becoming steadfast. Somebody who is not going to give up, no matter how the difficulty. And so we're going to end with a 947. Is that what we're singing? 945. Okay. Yeah, that's probably from Sunday. So 945 we'll sing to close out tonight. And if you have needs, if you have difficulties, if you need help in some way, you need prayers, you need just sit and study, you need just somebody to listen to kind of what's going on, or if there's anything you can need and we can do something as a congregation or individually, me or Rich or any one of the deacons or anybody here, just reach out and we'll try and do the best we can. It won't always be enough. People let us down all the time, but that's part of the struggle because we're just trying to grow and edify one another and so that we can spend eternity with God. So let's go ahead and sing 945 and let's go ahead and stand while we sing.